reading capital of the world. Today, we are speaking with a true friend, a role model in Mori Taheripour. She is the author of Bring Yourself, How to Harness the Power of Connection to Negotiate Fearlessly. So Mori is a globally recognized executive with 2 decades of negotiation, D&I, and even athletic and sports industry experience. She teaches negotiation at the Wharton School, which is how I met her and how many of my friends met her through a business school. And there she serves on the faculty of the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department. She is a 7-time recipient of awards for excellence in teaching. So it is absolutely an honor to have you on 99 Pages, Mori. Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm so excited to be here, actually. It's Sunday night where I am, 7:30 at night. So people were like, are you kidding, on a Sunday night? I have to you're going to wear makeup on a Sunday night? But I'm thrilled to be here. You are my newfound wingman, so I like it.
Absolutely. Well, I would love to start by just having you introduce yourself. You're a sports business expert, you're a negotiation coach, you're an athlete, a writer, a speaker, an entrepreneur. I would love to have the audience hear kind of the overarching themes that surround your work.
The sports thing used to be really unique because I'd started my career in public health, had always wanted to do something in sports, just couldn't figure it out. So when I did finally kind of find the angle that I was most interested in, it was really the social impact that sports has. And I thought, it's not just fandom that excites me, it's actually the entirety of the business and the ability for us to amplify the sports business to have impact in communities, whether it's athletes, teams, what have you. At that time, I wasn't teaching yet. So the whole notion of me teaching was so crazy to me. I would have never envisioned myself doing what I do. Now looking back, if you ask me what connects sort of the teaching and the sports and negotiations, I feel like I found sort of that calling. And the calling was still the social impact, but the impact on individuals, my students, the ability to have people find their strengths, to look at themselves in a different light. And that's sort of how sports is connected as well. I work with athletes. I work with a lot of athletes who are sort of transitioning out of the sport, getting them ready for life, really, helping them find transferable skills, right? Finding their value. So I think it's that connection to what can I do? What can I give back? How can I find sort of my calling? And it ended up really being around teaching, which is, who would have known? Who would have known 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if you said this is what you'd be doing, I would say you're nuts.
No kidding. One of the things in your book that really caught me, and I'd love to talk to you about, we've never really talked about this, is you got diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and you've accomplished so much. And I think that the act of overcoming those challenges associated with this disease are just remarkable. I'd love to start there if that's okay in your as we go on, because I think that sets the tone for a lot of your work in your humility, your ability to coach people to overcome the impossible. Like, can you talk to us a little bit about that and how it set the stage for you?
Yeah, so most people in my life had no idea I had been diagnosed. I didn't share it with anybody. The book was sort of my coming out party, if you will. So even a lot of people in my family didn't know. My immediate family knew. I just hadn't really led with it. And it was never about me being embarrassed. It was that I didn't want people to see me in a different light. And I didn't want people to think that, that's who I was. It's not who I am. I am strong and I'm healthy and, there's so much to be grateful for. And it was the diagnosis that made me feel that way. So it was always sort of my truth, but never out of sort of fear of sharing with people in terms of like, I don't want them to feel sorry for me necessarily, but I wanted them to see me as strong and somebody who was really fit and healthy. And I didn't want it to affect, the way people wanted me to work for them or travel or what people expected of me. I didn't want any of that. I wanted them to see me and see me alone. And so I didn't talk to people about it. When I was going to write this book, I thought, how am I asking people to be authentic and bring themselves when this may be the thing that I've never brought to conversations or shared with people. And I just wanted to meet my readers halfway and really bring my side of it to sort of the conversation. It may be the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I know that sounds crazy, but in the book, I sort of chronicle this. The first doctor that gave me the diagnosis, no bedside manners whatsoever. And I remember as soon as I heard it, all those images of people in wheelchairs not being able to take care of themselves, like all these things came flooding, right? And it was a shock to my system, but immediately I started thinking, who's going to take care of me? I'm not married. I have, like it just felt really lonely and it felt really scary. Fast forward that to, I was like, this is not my doctor. I need to look for another doctor. A friend of mine helped me get into Georgetown and see the doctor that I have now. And I have to say, the moment I walked into his office, he like gave me this really sort of big hug. And this notion of just connecting with somebody when I needed it most was incredible. And he sat me next to him and we looked at the computer. He showed me my MRI. He talked me through it. And what he saw in me was somebody who was strong and healthy and athletic. And he said, I just think that we need to keep you exactly as you are, which is strong and healthy. And you haven't had any relapses. He thought I had been sort of dealing with MS for a long time. He said he would have diagnosed me probably 8 years earlier. Actually,
Oh, wow.
Wharton, because he thought I had my first episode then. But he said, if that's what's happened to you, you haven't even been on medication, let's ensure you stay like this for a lifetime. And I walked an hour and some odd minutes later, I walked out of that office and everything changed. I saw myself in a different light. I saw myself fighting it. It was really visioning. I didn't see myself in a wheelchair. I didn't see any of that for myself. And in that moment, I realized the only thing I have to do is prioritize all those things that have kept me healthy, which is the working out and eating well and fighting the stress and sort of self-care, honestly. It changed everything. It changed everything.
And when you go into the classroom, do you find yourself kind of, is that the standard now? And because I think one thing all of your students have found in your classes is that you build a really personal relationship with your students. Like even like it's not negotiations class, it's therapy. And it's a great segue to your book about like the importance of actually knowing yourself first before you can walk into a negotiating room with confidence. I'm just curious, like, is that sort of like the standard you set for yourself for how you impact your students now?
I think if you ask me who in my life knows me best, I will always tell you my students.
Wow.
My closest friends may not see as much vulnerability from me as my students do. And I am a completely different person in the classroom, just more of myself. I'm open, Lord knows, you could ask any of my students, I cry, I'm emotional. And I feel so free in my classrooms. Nowhere else in my life do I feel that way. And again, I feel like if I'm asking them to be open and vulnerable and more of themselves, how dare I not show up the same way? And it just works. It just works.
That's super powerful. So your book covers several examples of successful and unsuccessful negotiations. So I'd like to kind of dive into a little bit about the contents of the book. And I'd love to start out with what doesn't work. And one of my favorite anecdotes from the book was, I believe you had an like an early stage negotiation exercise between a very aggressive archetype of, say, financial services, maybe, and a more passive female student who, on the surface, was just you didn't necessarily have the chutzpah, if you will, of a solid negotiator, or so we thought as we go through the anecdote. And I think this really lended itself to some common misconceptions on like what defines like successful and unsuccessful negotiations. So what in your experience, are some of the common themes in unsuccessful negotiations? And what is it that pushes us towards these techniques?
Yeah, so I think that was part of actually the reason why I wrote the book. I think there's a lot of myths out there about who's a good negotiator, right? Who can be a good negotiator? And the truth is, anybody can be a good negotiator or a great negotiator, right? We're not born with a negotiations gene. This is a purely learned skill. And so, the fact that people go through life thinking, oh God, I can't do this well, is just crazy to me, because negotiations is like the soundtrack of our lives. We wake up in the morning negotiating. By the time we go to sleep at night, God knows how many of those conversations we've had with ourselves, our loved ones, at work. So just it's everywhere all the time. And so when I get students in my classroom, I'm getting really experienced individuals who just haven't thought that all those conversations were negotiations, when in fact, if you define it a certain way, which is really problem solving, um, making big decisions, working through some issues, those are really moments of negotiation. So when I tell them to just think about it differently, immediately there is that that sense of confidence that comes out, right? Because they feel a little bit more empowered now that we're not defining it as combative, aggressive, win lose. It becomes something they feel much more comfortable talking about and stepping into. So now we're looking for how you can be a better negotiator, as well as, instead of me teaching you something you don't know how to do. It's a much easier thing to teach, by the way. Um, and so this book was supposed to bust those myths, right? The whole anybody can be a great negotiator. And I think that, for me, negotiations was never a transactional thing. It was always an opportunity for you to meet somebody, to strengthen a relationship, to create indelible relationships, to be curious about people, and then to learn more about them, right? So it was a value add to me. And that's the other thing I want to do through this book is don't be afraid of it. Embrace it. This is your voice, right? You can express yourself. You come to the table, you can share with people things that you should share and ask for, right? You deserve it. And then don't think about it as competition or a situation that actually results in you breaking a relationship up. Think about it as a moment to hear somebody and actually strengthening those relationships. So you have to do all of that in order to actually make people even understand it from the perspective that I want them to understand it, before you even actually get to theories and strategy and all that. So I want people to let go of the
Wow.
fear and really enjoy it.
Yeah, when I like, for me and my colleagues, many of whom are watching now who are in sales, and we identify as professional negotiators. It's so interesting because like the I feel like many of the infrastructure around like the sales profession is actually kind of funneled towards the like dehumanization of your customer on the other side of the table, in the sense that like we're going to talk about discounts, business value, we're going to talk about decision making criteria, we're going to talk about buying committees, and at the end of the day, what's interesting is that every decision is made by a human being whose identity as a corporate executive is probably trounced by their identity as a father or mother or
Yeah.
sibling or child even, right? And I think that your book actually flipped it on its head. I think I said it in my promo video, like it kind of broke me down. It's like, no, actually it's not a investor or a client or an employee. It's a parent, a child, a sibling, and understanding that, I think, was something I walked away with. I love your title, by the way, Bring Yourself. What do you think you meant by that? What were you trying to convey and impart on your reader? And how does this translate to, say, in more professional negotiations with like clients in these sort of corporate type boardrooms that some of us brief in?
So I'll go back to the previous question that you asked me about my two students that were very different. So you had the more aggressive, and then you had sort of the more accommodating personality type. And the reason in the book I cited that not being successful negotiations was not because she couldn't be more aggressive. It's that that wasn't her. She was an accommodating, more sort of, her values were in relationships. They weren't on this more sort of really combative, again, aggressive, competitive, personality type. So she thought in order to be successful in that conversation, she had to show up like him. Except for the fact that that's not who she was, right? And had she been more of just herself, I think she could have been quite disarming. She could have been much more charming, and she could have been really kind and sort of soften the edges, if you will. But she didn't give herself that permission. And I think that we do that often, right? We're told that we have to be, in order to be a great negotiator, great salesperson, you have to be more aggressive, right? It's not about them, it's about you, right? You get in their face, you're goal oriented, right? And that's not, for those who are, great, because I know plenty of great negotiators who are more competitive and what have you. But for those who feel like they're just acting, that they're pretending, it just doesn't work, because in the most sort of tense situations, we become more of ourselves, not less of ourselves. So I say just prepare for every negotiations in a way that brings more of your authentic voice, brings in your values, that you show up more of yourself, because that's who people will remember, right? The impact you have on a person is what changes maybe a one-time deal to, deal in perpetuity, because, people will remember how you made them feel, right? How you behaved in that negotiations and the impact you had on them. That works. So this book was, I guess, about giving people permission. Be authentic, be yourself, and you will find a way to be a wonderful, a solid, and exceptional negotiator.
If there were a theme, a quote to crystallize the thesis of your book, I love you invoking Maya Angelou. People won't remember what you said, but they will remember what you made them feel. And I think that's, I could not agree with you more. Had a fantastic question, I think, come in through the chat that I'd love to jump to. And for those watching, if you have any questions, very open, very casual discussion, please go ahead and throw your questions into the chat. Chelsea Jacobs, Wemba42 from San Francisco. Right on. Also my wife. Has asked, how do you approach
family?
Yeah. How do you approach negotiations when the other person doesn't have that perspective? And I think that this is actually something that I thought quite a bit as well, in the sense of like, I am pretty a self-assured person. Like, I could go into a negotiating room and I feel like, I'm not super aggressive. I'm not super passive. Like, I feel like I've adopted a lot of these characteristics you described. And so when I walk into a room and the person on the other side of the table is in the opposite state of mind, like they are the aggressive ones, they are the ones that are toxic to the long-term relationship. Like, how do you react? Like, how, when your authenticity doesn't disarm the person on the other side of the table, what is the next move? Like, how do you think past someone who isn't reciprocating?
I think that you said your authenticity doesn't disarm. I don't know if that is necessarily true. I think that really what happens is that if you just see this person and you're like, oh my God, this person is in my face, they're so combative, what am I going to do? I say be more of yourself, right? Because I feel like the way you actually disarm those type of people is when you're even more curious, right? When you can really truly see them, right? And you give them the stage, right? You let them talk about themselves. Like, I'm not even going to the transaction yet. We call this information exchange. This is the moment when you meet somebody and you want to humanize the thing, right? So I'm not going to focus on this transaction. I know you are, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on you. And I find that especially those type of people love to talk about themselves. What becomes disarming is giving that person this moment to shine, and you see them and you connect with them and you hear them and you're curious and you're not judging. And what changes really quickly, I think, is this person goes, oh my God, is this person really interested in me? And they're not talking about the transaction, and this feels really good. And I think that's disarming, right? That's that moment where you're like, forget the transaction. Let's just do this right now. Now, should you do that and that doesn't work, because nothing works 100% of the time, then I feel like we have to go back to our values and think, is this somebody who I even want to work with or negotiate with? If you do it on behalf of a company, you sort of have to. But if it's on your own behalf, we can make those decisions, right? And not every client is a good client, not every customer is a good client, not every, partner is going to make for a good partnership. And you just decide maybe this isn't the right relationship for me. But I think first you have to give that person a chance.
Well said, well said. And I think you've got some folks in the chat who sincerely agree with you as well. I think that resonated with a lot of people. The confrontational, the adversarial approach. Those folks really do want to talk about themselves at the end of the day. One thing that I think is fascinating, and particularly as someone who's gone through this, maybe not your course per se, but through the program at Wharton, is the idea of information arbitrage and the delta between personal and professional negotiations. And when I put your book down, I remember thinking to myself, well, on one end, I feel like I want to be the same in both circumstances. I want to bring myself and be authentic, and whether it's a business or a personal context. But at the same time, I also felt a very strong resistance to do that. And I'm just curious from and that resistance came from really like kind of my professional calling and my professional responsibilities and, the mandate of my role. And so I'm curious from your perspective, when you teach negotiation and especially when you practice it professionally, how do you separate out your strategy, whether it's like you're negotiating the purchase of your next house or car versus you're negotiating a big deal for an NFL player or something like that? Like, how do you bridge that gap?
I actually I don't distinguish between personal and business. I really don't. I think that a great negotiator can negotiate well in any situation. And it's largely because I think there are just some universal truths, no matter short term or long term, business, professional. I think there are certain things that people react well to, and frankly, I think they deserve. I think kindness will always prevail. I think that humanity always prevails. I think that, like I said earlier, everybody wants to be seen. And I think everybody, when they're speaking, they want to be heard. And so, if those become my values and I lead with that always, then whether it's a car I'm buying or whether it's a client, it doesn't matter because I feel like everybody deserves those things. And so I think that's why I don't distinguish between them, because my strategy is just humanity, right? I want that for people. But the bigger thing about sort of negotiations in these different situations is how well you're prepared for them. And your preparation, that's where you build in sort of some of the, like, what do I want as a goal? What do I want as an outcome? And that's more sort of tactical. Maybe those things change, of course. And again, whether it's short term, long term, what have you. But I just don't distinguish between them because at the end of the day, again, I feel like I'm best when I'm curious. I'm best when I don't lead with judgment. I'm best when I practice humility and want to learn. And I just feel like, what else is there? Like, if I can just lean into those things, even if I don't get a good deal, at least I'll never regret my behavior. And that's more important to me than anything else.
There are worse things to lose in life than a little bit of money, aren't there? Yeah, we tend to forget that, don't we? We had a wonderful question come in, and it's actually from one of my very favorite classmates, Mrs. Karen Kwan. Hi, Mori and Rajiv. Thanks for speaking today. Great to see you both. Hi, Karen. If you were writing your book in what is, for many people these days, a remote working environment, would you add any new tips? What changes over Zoom? And this is, I think, a very insightful question because, I think many of us in the lockdown have taken stock of like the value of physical presence and what is missing from relationships when you are not physically there. And I think there's a missing intimacy. I think there's a missing sense of like confidence in reading body language, things like that. What do you think? How does the theme of your book? What are some of the additions, the COVID addendum you would write if you had to?
Yeah, I mean, all my students know that they were never allowed to have cell phones in the classroom. They couldn't have their cell phones on. They couldn't have their computers on. So anything that sort of connected you with the outside world, I was like, turn it off, shut it off. And I was really kind of strict about this because my whole thing is, how do you communicate well with someone? How can you deeply connect with someone if you're distracted, right? So I wanted them to practice shutting it all off.
Mm-hmm.
You make plans, God laughs. We only use now computers or cell phones, what have you, to do these Zoom calls and connect with people, right? So at first glance, I mean, I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, everything I've taught them, what happens now? But so I've been working on this since March, right? I've been teaching since March a lot. And what I've learned is that, everything I taught is even more important now, right? Sure, you're on Zoom, but it's almost like somebody's sitting in front of you. So you still have to turn off your cell phones. You still have to turn off those distractions. And, things are actually a little bit more intimate now, I would say, right? I get to see people's living rooms now, or their kitchens, or their babies, or the dog, or, so people are sharing with us parts of themselves we normally never would have seen. And so that's a privilege. That is a sense of intimacy we didn't have before. So I don't think about, oh my God, I can't connect with this person, in a classroom anymore, though I yearn for my students' energy, I have to say. But what I do before every one of these calls or my classes is I put everything away. I see nothing. I don't look at chat. I have TAs who do that. I just stare and I take it all in and I bask in it and I'm grateful for it. And I think that everybody can do that, right? Get rid of the distractions. There are even more of them now. Create your space, give that person the attention and see them, right? Notice even things about their backgrounds, comment on that, right? And I think there's a way to make these conversations even more intimate than they were, which may sound really crazy to people, but I think it can be really powerful, actually.
As you're talking, and I actually felt this way as well when you spoke about your experience with multiple sclerosis. You exhibit something that I think I'm going to reference a book. We actually read it with our Wharton book club, which is Anti-Fragile. You're demonstrating anti-fragility in each of these situations, whether it was multiple sclerosis, COVID lockdowns. You're turning it on its head and actually making it a positive in kind of showing that it's not just about being resilient in tough times. It's actually about thriving because of those tough times, that obstacle, whether it's COVID, and it's actually a pretty remarkable trait to exhibit. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think your book and your class was so impactful for so many of us. So thank you very much for that. I think as we're talking, there is, and Karen, by the way, says great insight and advice, and thank you, Maury. She's another big fan, as we all are.
I'm a big fan of Karen.
Aren't we all? I think a question that will absolutely have to be discussed today is you live in DC, right? In Washington, DC, our nation's capital. Ironically, a city that is not known for great negotiation, I believe, at this point in our nation's story. What is your take on our current civic environment? Why are we struggling to negotiate on the most simple of issues where there is actually opportunity for consensus, I feel? And so I'd love your counsel, your guidance, your wisdom on like how we as Americans who are very frustrated with the tenor in our nation's capital, like what is the negotiation story diagnosis, if you will, for us right now?
Yeah, it's been bad for a long time, and really kind of got to a boiling point where we couldn't even have political conversations with people, right? So I think that where we've gone wrong, first of all, as far as let's just talk about political conversations, and I'll get to the disaster that we call Capitol Hill. But the political conversations became all about how am I going to change this person's mind? How am I going to get them to think like I do? And I think that going into any of those conversations was really difficult if that's where you started, because that immediately says, I'm right, you're wrong. So I'm going to change your mind so you can think more like me. As opposed to, I want to better understand why you think the way you do. So maybe what we aim for first is understanding as opposed to one person changing the other person's mind. Now, that may sound really simple. It is not. There was a lot of people that I couldn't even have conversations with, and I teach this stuff. So, you come to a point where you say, we agree to disagree, right? Wave that white flag, right? But I think that has to change over time, right? And there has to be more respect, that we have to become more curious. We just do. You have to sort of expand your horizons, think differently. And that's something that we have to personally take responsibility for. But what happens on Capitol Hill, I feel like, to your point, there's so much more that they share than the things that actually they would disagree on if they started with what's our collective goal. And in negotiations, we call them interests, right? So the why are we here? We're here to serve people. Why is it that people don't have better healthcare? And you sort of, and that's our why, right? We want people to be healthier, spend less on healthcare, have access to it. And I think there'd be a lot of agreements if we talked about the whys, but they jump right to the what's, what we call positions. And positions are fixed, right? It's one way or the highway. Whereas interest can be shared, interest can be flexible, interest can be, a much bigger perspective. And so if we started there, I think things would change really quickly. Now, will they? I don't know. I like to call myself an optimist most of the time. I don't know. I'm hoping that because we're all dealing with so many hard things right now, because people are dying and there's grief and there's loss, that maybe that will speak to their hearts and they can take a step back and find collectively ways to change the situation. If not now, when? I just can't think of a bigger crisis that would bring them together. So I pray that they find a better way to have these conversations so they can have better solutions.
Fantastic. I love the way you framed it, by the way, and I think it's a valuable lesson. The difference between an interest and a position. And your position is fixed. And if you start from that position you hold and your goal is to change the other person's mind, you're starting from a default position that the other person is wrong, doesn't know what they're talking about. And it's very easy to vilify a person when you're in that headspace. It's easy to be hostile to that person. Whereas if we really fundamentally start from like, what are our cumulative shared interests? What do we really all care about? Not only is it probably a better way to preserve the long-term relationship, even in the event of an impasse, but it's probably the best solution to actually overcome that impasse in the first place. So it's such an interesting perspective. As we talked even about with Karen's question about COVID, it occurred to me something like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would have like nightcaps together. There was a time where most of our congressional representatives like lived and worked in DC. They had dinners together. The kids went to school together. It almost like created a little community, which subsequently got branded as like being a insider, a Washington insider. And so then everybody just goes and maintains isolation in their own districts, if you will, and they don't have that kind of community. And I think what you've just given a framework for is like why interests are probably easier to find. Shared interests are easier to find when you have that sort of proximity and authenticity accessible to you. And I assume you've lived that experience as well. I assume that in your own business, as you go off and consult, like, do you find that kind of translates, like the more kind of proximity you have with your clients, your folks that you're negotiating with, your opportunity for more successful longer term relationships improves?
Absolutely, because to understand somebody's interests means that you've taken the time to better understand their background, their journey, what motivates them, the way they make decisions, their values, right? It's really powerful if you think about interests in that perspective, right? What motivates you is very different than what do you want, right? And so What motivates you to make decisions? Very different than, do you want to go here or do you want to go there, right? It's not a black and white thing. It's a real deep sense of empathy and understanding. And so if you can do that, then I feel like there are opportunities for us to find shared interests, right? There are ways for us to find commonalities. We may not agree on everything, but there are certainly things where we can find commonality, and then maybe things that we don't agree on that we can maybe compromise on. So what's important to you is not so important to me. I'll give that up, and vice versa, right? So that becomes possible when we're curious. I think the one advice I would give to everybody is work on your level of curiosity. Come to the table curious always, right? And I heard this term the other day, which I now am in love with. It's confident humility. And what that means is that, you're certainly confident in yourself. You have an understanding of your value, what you bring to the conversation, the assets that you're bringing in. But you have the humility to know that there's always something else to learn, that you don't have to know everything. You don't have to always be right, because we're not. So don't set that standard for yourself. Be confident enough to say, I don't know, when you don't know, and be confident enough to open your heart so you can learn. And I think that if we do that, then I think that's really the secret sauce here, right? Find out more about the other person, then you start problem solving. Find more about the person, then you could start innovating. And you're not sort of limiting the possibilities.
I think your book actually did this in a really interesting way, which was you spoke a little bit about some anecdotes of professional athletes that you've counseled and what life is like for them after they leave their teams and go off into the real world, the rest of us. And it was actually a moment where I had to like open up my mind and my heart to kind of understand a perspective that I held a very distorted view of. Like, when I see these Super Bowl games, I see these NFL players making, bongo bucks, and I'm like, oh, those guys are set for life. They're taken care of. And you were able to kind of, through your sort of sharing your story of negotiating with these NFL players, like, show like what life really is like for them. And it's not as glamorous, and it gave me pause. So I would love to just take a moment and dive into your practice in athletics and sports, and help us kind of, put us in the headspace of that player. What is going through their hearts and minds? What are their fears? And what did you discover about them through that very unique experience?
I learned that every one of them is different, just as every human being is different. You can't really judge, right, before you know. And so when I first started working with NFL players, it was at Wharton, the Wharton Sports Business Initiative. And I know, as a student, I know you all can attest to this, after 3 hours of class, like, you are done. They would sit there through like 10 hours or 8 hours of classes all day long, right? So I was just amazed how they could do this. And then I realized that this is what they do. They sit through hours of team meetings, right? They study film. They work so hard, and they're so focused when they want to be, right? And of course, whoever's in front of them has to engage them, obviously. But that was amazing to me, right? They were curious. And this isn't everybody. These people were sort of the folks that showed up wanted to be there. So they were sort of self-selected. But that immediately made me think, okay, there's no judgment here. There's really some really unique individuals who, again, I had the privilege to know, and some were big names, others not. Then I started to realize that they have the same vulnerabilities as other people. The truth is that their career in the NFL could be limited to 3.5 years or so, right? That's the average length of an NFL career. Most don't have guaranteed contracts, right? So when you think about it that way, you think about these guys really putting their life on the line, and they go out and they entertain us. And at any moment, some horrible, horrible injury can occur. At which point, where are you without a guaranteed contract? Not everybody is a Patrick Mahomes who really sort of changed the game with a $141 million, portion of his contract being guaranteed. Historic, amazing. And do I think that was important? Absolutely, because I think that they're the ones that sort of changed that conversation. but most don't, right? And so I think that what they have to learn and what they do learn when they go through these programs, what I helped with, is to say, okay, let's think about your strengths. Let's think about everything that you do in your career that can translate to the outside world. That being able to sit there and listen to somebody for that long and learn, and not hold on to a loss for a week, but immediately you have to get yourself back up and plan for the next game. Most of us can't deal with a loss that big, without thinking about it for months on end, right? We beat ourselves up. We can't get over it. Woe is me. They're like, there's no time for tears, right? We're getting up. We have to go. And so, what we do, the folks that sort of provide this type of education to these athletes, is trying to make them more confident as decision makers while they're playing, but then also prepare them to better understand both themselves and their life decisions, and how to communicate with people using some of the skills they've built up after they leave the game. And it's hard. It is. Don't look at the money. Like, there's so much more to the struggles, right? And they come back into community or their homes after being gone and being focused on one thing only for years and years and years. Just think about communication alone. That's why you see divorces, and that's why you see a lot of sort of mental health issues. There's a lot there. I just feel like they're misunderstood. I can go on about this forever, but there's a lot of good that athletes can do for us, and I think that they just need our help to better learn some of those things, whether it's philanthropy or business, so that they can have the impact that they should and could have.
Super fascinating. I actually would love to dive in a little deeper. Well, first off, like, what do you think? Why is it so hard for us to understand this demographic? Like, I consider myself a relatively well-read, self-aware, and globally aware person. Like, I even had these stigmas in my head of, this glitz and glam life of a professional athlete. Like, what is it about? Like, where does this stigma come from? Why are these problems not more, I guess, pervasive in the media? Like, why are we not more aware of them? As a society, as a culture?
Because they make a lot of money. So we think, oh, like, if you make that much money, what do you have to complain about, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's such a limited way of thinking about these things. Particularly, again, the NFL is a great example because most don't have guaranteed contracts, right? So while they entertain us, they're putting their lives at risk. And somehow we think they shouldn't deserve that kind of money, right? And so, I feel for them from that perspective, right? The head injuries, the, injuries to their limbs, they may never walk again, right? The neck is snapped. I mean, it's insane. And we cheer for them when they're up, and want to tear them down when they make a mistake. And I think that's just in our society, right? We idolize people and then don't want to give them second chances when something happens. I think it's also that they love what they do, and they ended up having the opportunity to do exactly what they loved. And most of us, I think, wish that could happen to us, right? So there is that, right? There, like, they talk about, all I ever wanted to do was play football, and now I'm playing football, right? All I ever wanted to do was be a basketball player, and they're living their dream. But their dream doesn't last forever, right? And when these careers end, they end at a really young age. Like, you could have a guy who gets hurt, gets out of the NFL 3 years later, and he's like 24, and that's the end of his career, right? So then when we're making decisions for our next move, they have to do the same, but haven't necessarily been prepared the same way we are. So, there's a lot that is misconstrued again, and I think that media doesn't help, right? Great stories don't sell as bad as really bad ones, right? And so I just think I think there's a lot of really, really amazing people that should be highlighted, athletes, like anybody else in our society, right? These stories that are human interest stories, they tell the good of people, and I don't know if we see enough of that from in sports. So we don't empathize as much.
Yeah, very fascinating. I actually, as you were talking, I wanted to ask you a question. So let's put it this way. When I think about where my stigma came from when I came to the professional athlete culture, a lot of it is because these are some of the most hyper masculine people that I could even ever design. Like a guy like Brett Favre, a Tom Brady, right? Like these icons of masculinity, they're of leadership, right? They are just they feel and look like titans, and it is hard to come to a point of sympathy or empathy or compassion when you feel like you're analyzing someone who is like the epitome of leadership and masculinity and toughness and resilience and achievement. And I think what you're doing, you're just peeling the onion. It's like, this is an extremely risky and dangerous profession. Yes, it is. The potential to be lucrative, but that with high reward comes incredible risk and discomfort and loss and sacrifice in other areas. And yeah, it's interesting to hear your perspective and the level of compassion that you have for these folks. Another question, if you don't mind me asking, is like, how did you even get into this business of coaching and mentoring these athletes?
Like I said earlier, I wanted to be in sports most of my life, and hadn't quite figured out the angle. When I got to Wharton, that was like my main goal. I was like, whatever I do, somehow, some way, while I'm here, I got to figure out how I'm going to do this. And talked to one of my professors at the time, ended up being my mentor, ended up being the reason why I teach. But he said, we're going to launch this thing called the Wharton Sports Business Initiative. The dean has given us a green light, but we need to write a business plan. And, do you want to be essentially part of it? So I became sort of a co-founder of it, and it became the opportunity. That was the door that was open to me to start working with these professional athletes. And I talk about the NFL a lot because that's where it all started. But yeah, Wharton, your education.
I too.
Beyond anything I could have ever envisioned, actually. So that's how it all came together. I want to say one thing to you though, and again, I talk about the NFL, but that's sort of where a lot of my experience has been. But even NBA players or baseball players, I mean, it is hyper masculine, but that's just what they do. That's not necessarily who they are. So the minute they're off the court, they're human beings, right? And their fathers, their sons, their grandsons, right? And so if you recall when Kobe Bryant passed away, when a lot of these guys were grieving, right? LeBron James cried on TV, right? But what we started hearing was, how dare they, right? You're not supposed to cry. You're supposed to be a real man, right? And so there was sort of backlash on their sensitivity, right? On their ability to show their feelings. And it happened with the George Floyd incident as well. And so when they opened up and shared, we wanted to say, oh no, that's not supposed to be you. You're supposed to be that hyper masculine, be what we're not, right? And the minute they showed that side of them, it wasn't accepted. So I think that they too have to live up to societal expectations like the rest of us do. So we want to see them that way, but that's just their job. That's not who they are. The minute the helmet comes off, I talk about Hardy Nickerson in my book, who was a student of mine, John Lynch. I mean, these guys, they put the helmet on. They were one person. You get to meet them in person, and they are some of the kindest, most wonderful, empathetic people I've ever met. And so, I just want to remind people that just like we're not our jobs, they're our careers, it's the same thing with them. They're just human.
Well said. And I think you actually struck a chord with me there too. If there's one thing I've learned over this past year, definitely being in lockdown, it's like, I didn't understand like to what extent like passion and actual emotional sensitivity, like what that actually plays in performance. And it's not always like the rational, by the book, straight shooter thinker that like is going to the top in any profession. Sometimes it takes that spark, that gravitas, and with that comes some, sometimes some emotional sensitivity. And for LeBron James to shed tears, it just to me shows a degree of like power and like that, how, the passion that he held for that player and Kobe, and as a role model, as a leader and It's a really powerful image. Thank you for sharing that. We actually had a great question come in through the chat, and I hope you don't mind talking about this. But the question is, I would love to understand your opinion of Colin Kaepernick's decision in his relationship with his contract, in both his decision to, we're referencing his decision to take a knee for the national anthem. And for those who aren't aware, this is a very interesting topic in sports, and particularly for the NFL community, where in protest of police brutality against Black Americans, he would take a knee during the national anthem to draw attention to that issue. And it obviously affected a lot of people in different ways. If you were hyper patriotic, it looked very offensive, etc. And so, Maury, I'd love to, have your take on what that demonstration was.
Yeah, so Colin Kaepernick had been hurt initially prior to him taking a knee, and during the time that he wasn't playing, he was curious. So he started reading more and more of these books about his own history, as a Black man in America. And the more he read, the more he learned. And people will tell you that's who he was his entire life, right? He had this sort of very curious mindset, intellectual curiosity. And so by the time he was ready to play again, he had some feelings about these things. Now he was sort of informed, fully not really, but enough to sort of move him, right? And he wanted to, in a very peaceful way, use the only platform he thought he had that was the most powerful thing he could use, which is to kneel before sort of during the national anthem before he played. And at first, nobody even noticed. It took probably like 3 games before anybody even noticed. And then all of a sudden, of course, the brouhaha, right? All hell broke loose. And he learned as we moved forward through that process, right? And sort of started really honing in on his message, which we now see was truth. It was his truth, but it was truth. And again, it was peaceful protest. Now, my feeling about it is that he opted out of his contract with the Niners at the end of that year anyway. And I think probably he thought he would get picked up. Is it fair? I don't really like using that word, but I don't know. I think he was ready to play. He was in great shape. He could have played. There's a lot more to this that I can't necessarily share, but I can tell you that everything may not be as it exactly seems. People can make decisions about the opportunities that are given to them. But again, I don't disagree with people. That shouldn't have been the reason why a team didn't pick him up. In fact, in my opinion, it should have been every reason for a team to have picked him up because of his sense of community and the way he could connect to people. There are certain teams he would have been perfect for. But here we are. And what we see in retrospect is that very thing he was trying to do is now sort of in vogue, right? Everybody now wants to protest, and it was the wrong, that cause means something to people. He was just sort of ahead of his time in some ways. I think his legacy isn't how he played football. I think his legacy is the person that changed the conversation and forced us into having some really difficult conversations, and what he gives back to community and the impact that he's had, which is far greater. I went to that Super Bowl game when the Niners got there in New Orleans and they lost, and it killed me. But when I think about Colin Kaepernick, I honestly don't think of him as an amazing quarterback, though he was. I think of him as an amazing human being who took his platform and did something so much more important with it. And if we all did that, think about the change that we could create in this world. He was courageous. He was gutsy. And I think we're celebrating him now for it.
Absolutely. Incredibly well said. And talk about someone who brought themselves, right, to his place of work. I mean, I have, followed the story quite a bit, and I gotta say he's a remarkable figure, and I think you're right, where his legacy is actually going to trounce anything he did in the NFL. And you're right, he was an awesome QB too, and clearly an awesome leader, and it is very surprising he did not get picked up.
Wingspan is amazing. And he, you know, he was fast, he was strong, he was everything you could have wanted. But you know, it's football is a business. And do
Yeah.
I agree with the team said? No, but you know, that was 5 years ago. And look at what he's accomplished. So I wish the conversation didn't just rest there anymore, like how unfair it is that he's not playing. Look at all he's done. And I think that's what we need to sort of focus on. He could probably still play. He's in that great of shape, but I don't know. Like, is that what's important now?
Right.
I don't think so.
I think his Nike campaign is probably accomplishing more of his mission than anything.
Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to start crystallizing here. And I want to thank everybody. We had quite a few viewers popping in, and we're just so grateful for everyone's attention. Again, the book is Bring Yourself. We've been speaking with Mori Taheripour. I highly encourage a read at your convenience. But Mori, I'd love to start wrapping up here. You've got a demographic of readers of folks in a variety of industries that follow 99 pages. What is your overarching like thesis that you want us to walk away with, having talked to you, having read your book? If you could leave us with some parting words of wisdom that we can take forward in our negotiations, both personal and professional, I think that'd be a great way to end.
Yeah, I think that we spend so much of our lives trying to be somebody that we're not. And whether it's family expectations, cultural expectations, societal expectations, gender roles, whatever it is. And I think that if we took the opportunity, we looked at negotiations as that time, as that opportunity where we give ourselves permission to be ourselves. And look, you know, certain companies have, you know, certain cultures. And I'm not saying that you disrespect the culture of the company and just show up exactly like you want to show up. I mean, that's not what I'm saying at all. I think we have better gut instinct than that. I think that emotional intelligence helps us navigate those situations. But all I'm saying is that who's to say, right, what I should be and how I should be and how I should show up. And I've lived a lot of my life being constrained to cultural norms and things my parents wanted, things what other people wanted of me. But when I tell you that the thing I love about teaching so much is the opportunity to speak my truth when I walk into a classroom, to be free, to be vulnerable, to be open. And I'm pretty good at what I do, I think. And I think that's the reason why. It's not because I'm smarter than anybody else or know more than anybody else. I'm just more of myself. And the ability to connect with people at that level is profound. Let people in, right? And let them see you and then see them. I think that these times more than any time in sort of from what I remember, people want to connect, people want to be seen, people deserve to be seen. And I would just say lean into that, right? Lean into the connections, lean into the small talk, lean into the humanity of the experience. Because why not, right? And you don't know what can come of it, right? Instead of focusing on what I'm going to get at the end of this conversation, you sort of should fall in love with the process, right? The journey there. And people surprise you for the good and the bad, but I've found a lot of good. And so this is not Pollyanna, you know, rainbows and butterflies. I mean, my students know I do focus on strategy and getting the best deal. But I think we need to assess what that means for us as individuals. And sometimes it's not getting more, it's just getting enough, and enough for what your heart needs at that moment, enough for what makes you satisfied. And let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate being satisfied, right? Feeling content in that moment, feeling like, you know, there's more to life than that drive to just more, 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 more. I just think that's exhausting. So I wish people would just take the time to understand their values, know who they are, and have the courage to just be. And you can do it in negotiations. It's a platform.
Fantastic. I love, well said. I love the delta between getting more versus getting enough and finding that sense of contentment. Mori, thank you so much for everything you've done for me, my class, our alma mater, and obviously for 99 Pages. We're just incredibly big fans of yours. I'm so proud of you. I'm proud of your book. Hit the 1 year mark of your release in March. So we're excited to help push it out further. To all our viewers at 99 Pages, thank you so much for tuning in. We had over 100 people click through and watch our broadcast tonight, which is absolutely fantastic. Thank you for the support. It means the world to me. Have fun. And we'll be back next week. We're speaking with Mr. Sunil Gupta, author of Backable, about what it means to get folks to get behind you on whatever project you're working on. It's going to be a great conversation, whether you're an entrepreneur looking for work, whether you've got, whether you're an investor yourself. If you're in that market, we're going to have a great conversation with Sunil Gupta next week on his book Backable. Looking forward to it. Thanks again. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you.